Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Marius Roodt, who has electricity. Marius, how are you?
How's it, Nick? Feeling very positive about the country, seeing as Eskom failed to load shed me this afternoon. So maybe things are looking up.
Glorious.
Things are much better, yeah. I'm going to vote ANC next
Glorious.
day, I think.
And we're also joined by Mr. Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you, sir?
Well, I don't have electricity. As you can see,
Neither do I.
It's rather gothic.
Yeah, so we're looking a little bit gloomy today. And let's get on to probably what is the only big news story at the moment. When I was looking through the headlines today, this was overwhelmingly in the news, and not just here in South Africa, but making news overseas. And one hopes, when you're making news overseas, it's going to be because an actress from South Africa has won an award, or a scientist has invented something cool, or, we've been ranked highest best tourist destination in the world. But unfortunately, we're being mentioned in the news because it appears, according to the Americans, that we may have put our foot in the great geopolitical conflict of our age. The American ambassador to South Africa, Reuben Brigety, claimed last week on Friday that the United States has evidence that in December of 2022, South Africa gave weapons and ammunition to the Russian Federation in order for it to continue its invasion of Ukraine. This was apparently done through a cargo ship called the Lady R, which is a Russian vessel owned by a company which is under sanction. The company has previously found to have been transporting, I think it was artillery shells or something, from Iran to Russia. During the press conference that the ambassador gave, he said the arming of Russians is extremely serious, and we do not consider the issue to be resolved. In what was possibly one of the most frank exchanges I've ever seen from an American ambassador, much less one from South Africa, where South African ambassador, the Americans in South Africa tend to play very nice with the government, regardless of what the government says to them. This ship was actually, I remember seeing online, open source intelligence people were tracking it in December of last year, and it turned off its transponder just before entering Simonstown military naval base in South Africa, at which point it then emerged a few days later with no explanation of what it was doing. At the time, I believe the DA government in the Western Cape asked National what exactly the ship was doing, and the sort of reply was, "Oh, we don't know, we're looking into it, what ship? I don't know what you're talking about." Satellite photos also confirmed that it was docked in Simonstown Harbor. In response to this, there have been there was a lot of fury and fire. The ambassador, the ANC claimed that the ambassador had retracted his remarks. He hadn't, in fact, retracted his remarks. What he did was he said, "I'm sorry for the way I handled this. I didn't do it as diplomatically as I could have." And in fact, some former diplomats have actually attacked him, saying that he wasn't nice enough to the South African government over this. The Ukrainians have also, I think, asked the South African ambassador to meet their representatives in Kiev. Zelensky held a phone call with Ramaphosa this morning, where he said that they had discussed issues of the peace plan and various things. He gave a very sort of neutral tweet, and then followed it up by saying, quote, "Anyone who helps the aggressor with weapons will be an accomplice with all the consequences." Terence, let's start with you. What are there going to be consequences? Is the Americans going to be as upset about this as they seem to be currently?
Well, it depends on how this plays out. The suggestion that South Africa might lose AGOA access has been floated, and this is actually not a new thing. South Africa's had contretemps with America over various issues, some trade related, some political, for a long time. And also remember that we don't technically qualify for AGOA access because South Africa is considered too developed. But so America doesn't need to sanction us. it just needs to kind of revoke that that preferential market access, and it will do a great deal of damage. I think that what was particularly interesting about this was that the American ambassador quoted from an ANC party document, and I think this is quite revolutionary for a diplomat. It's been I think something like an implicit agreement to pretend that in South Africa, party and state are separate entities. I don't think the ANC has ever seen it like this. I know now they're trying to sort of scroll back a bit, and I think it was former Minister Mufamadi saying, well, no, the party has an influence, but this isn't government position. Well, let's just say that if I look at someone like Clayton Moniela, I think that his, he might skirt around the use of the term imperialism, but the fundamental narrative is the same. South Africa has for a long time tried to position itself as, or at least the ANC, and with it, the South African government, and therefore South Africa kind of by default has tried to position itself as a part of an anti-Western bloc. These are not relationships that are carried out with any great finesse. Also, probably because we have a de-skilled diplomatic corps, like much of the rest of our civil service. But yeah, I think this could be a moment when all that comes home to roost. At the very least, here's a consideration. Something strange happened. Now, you mentioned satellite photographs. Well, people with their cell phones are taking pictures of it. And for the president of the country to say that, to suggest or imply that he doesn't know what a foreign vessel was doing in a military port, it just beggars belief. So let's forget about the Americans for a while. Think about the insult to South Africa's own people, that the president and the ministry and the Minister of Defense pretend that this is some sort of great mystery, like the sighting of Sasquatch in the Drakensberg or something like that.
Marius, this isn't the first time that we've seemed to have put our foot in this geopolitical conflict, despite the fact that the government has declared that it is strictly neutral. It's not taking any sides. It's not involved in this conflict.
Not aligned.
Subsequently, since those declarations have been made, we have done military exercises with China and Russia's navies. We also have talked for about 24 hours withdrawing from the ICC, and in fact the government has still not ruled that out. And now we're being accused of giving arms to one side of the conflict. What's your take on this whole story?
Well, it's the usual. It's quite a mess, obviously. And if Cyril Ramaphosa, either he's lying. If we did give arms to Russia and he says no, he doesn't know what's going on, he's either lying or he doesn't know what his own government's doing, which both those outcomes are not exactly, they're not optimal, put it that way. And it's, but even apart from whether we gave arms to Russia or not, it's pretty clear in our voting behavior in the UN and so on that we're definitely not truly non-aligned on this issue. And all the BRICS, there was recently another vote in the UN when all the BRICS, except for us and Russia, voted to condemn the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And I just don't understand why we would be. There's obviously history with Russia, even though it was actually the Soviet Union and all kinds of things. And the ANC obviously has a soft spot for Russia. But it's clear that this is an aggressive invasion of another country. And it boggles my mind that the South African government is so supportive of what's been happening there. And so we need, it's just all you can do is really roll your eyes and wonder what's going on. But also I think something else to point out is that we all obviously know that the Democrats are in charge in Washington at the moment. The Democrats and the ANC have always had a better relationship than the Republicans and the ANC. And the fact that the Democrats or Democratic-controlled government in the US has come out so hard against the ANC is quite telling, I think. And it's definitely something that the ANC should take note of. And look what happened on Friday with Iran and so on. These kinds of decisions have real economic consequences. And we must remember, behind all the economic numbers and the rand getting weak and all that kind of thing, there's actual real people who get affected by this. Things get more expensive, people lose jobs, and all kinds of things. So there are real consequences to doing these kinds of things. So And so I saw somebody said on Twitter, South Africa's definitely in the finding out phase of the effing around bits of doing things,
That seems a fairly accurate summation of our foreign policy. I am one of those people affected, as I'm planning to go on a trip to the United States in June. So I'm really loving the government right now.
That's what you call a first world problem there.
Such a beating. No, sure. I'm not sure we said the worst affected by the problem. I'm just saying that it's not endearing me to the state right now in particular. Terence, any final thoughts on this story before we move on?
Look, I think that a great deal more still needs to be revealed. Whether it was arms or what I would tend to say might be a more plausible explanation, not arms as in battlefield weapons, because most of our stuff is to a NATO rather than a Russian standard, but perhaps military medical supplies, drones, things that could be used in a conflict situation. But what South Africa seems to have done now is in some ways a little different from the sometimes robustly expressed critiques that the ANC and the South African government expressed over the American invasion of Iraq. At least in that stage, it was a highly controversial thing. The Germans, the French, some pretty close allies of the Americans, opposed it. This has split the world, I think, quite sharply into those that are broadly on Team Ukraine, which includes places like South Korea, Japan, Australia, and those on Team Russia. And I think America regards this sort of thing as far more as far more injurious to its national interests than criticizing its invasion of a very much a kind of second-rate power. And I think that this is perhaps a case of the kid who pulled the tiger's tail. It's all very well to damn America as the world imperialists and say we are marching forward as a front of the anti-imperialist bloc. But when this does come down to weapons of war and where you stand when actual blood and treasure is being expended, it takes on a whole new dimension. And I think unfortunately the leadership of South Africa at the moment is just not up to it one way or another.
Right, let's move on to our next story now. A little bit coming back home. I don't know how long we're going to spend on this one, because I think it's a topic we've talked about a lot. But to everyone's surprise, André de Ruyter suddenly published a book over the weekend. It came out on I think it was on Sunday, with some extracts appearing in the media. The book was allegedly, I think I read somewhere, they said that they published it with so little forewarning because they didn't want anyone to stop its publication. And it's filled basically with an account of de Ruyter's time at Eskom. Various quotes have appeared in the media now. De Ruyter referred to Mpumalanga as the Wild West in terms of law, where stakeholder events have to offer buffets because individually plated meals open the door for poisoning. He talks about the problem that Technikon degrees are considered the same as university degrees for the purposes of satisfying affirmative action. But in reality, Technikon degrees are not the same as engineering degrees. And this means that people get placed into positions that they're not qualified for. He talks about his run-in with Gwede Mantashe when at some conference or meeting or something, Gwede Mantashe came up to him and said, quote, "Oh, well, this is de Ruyter's claim. CEO, you better fasten your seatbelt. The ride is going to get bumpy from now on," in a sort of menacing tone. He talks about how Ibrahim Patel believed that the world owed South Africa something, and that's why we should be given preferential treatment in various foreign deals and foreign funding deals. He talks about what he called the cowardice of big business, saying that it lacked courage, and that when he brought allegations of corruption to a big business meeting, a lot of the businesses, they were more concerned about not annoying the ANC and rather just kind of putting their heads down. He then finishes off by saying that he has the satisfaction that he at least tried at Eskom, unlike the 28 other CEOs who apparently approached and turned it down. And then he claims that he said he did his best when armchair critics aplenty were wringing their hands. So, Marius, what do you make of all this? I think there's quite a lot here. It's sort of a bit weird that this book kind of came out of nowhere. I didn't know about it beforehand. I don't know if you did. What do you make of all this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he's saying anything that's very unexpected. I mean, I've obviously just read the News 24 article. I haven't read the book, but nothing there surprises me from the kind of way that Abraham Patel thinks there's a South African exceptionalism, and South Africa's sort of owed something by the rest of the world, which I think is still something that a lot of people in the ANC and actually broadly in South Africa believe. But that's not how the case is, and it's a dog-eat-dog world out there in international politics and so on. And I think South Africa needs to realize that. And I mean, I'll give one thing to De Ruyter. I think there's a lot to criticize him for, but I think he is right. He's one of the only people who did actually come to fix Eskom, and he was obviously given a poison chalice. I don't think he was ever given the chance to really fix the organization. He didn't get the support he needed, but at least he tried. That's one thing. And like he says, I mean, it's very easy for people to sit on the sideline and say this is what André de Ruyter should have done. At least he did try to do something. And I think he'll probably be judged fairly kindly by history. Maybe not with his stint as CEO of Nampak, but I think he did try. He was fighting good fights at Eskom, and I think good for him. But yeah, as I said, I don't think there's anything really surprising that that's going to come out of these revelations. And just I mean, I think it makes your hair stand on end if you read some of the stuff that he talks about.
Considering all the stuff that happened at Eskom during his tenure, I'm not surprised that he perhaps found it a little bit difficult to point out what he thought was the best moments of his time at Eskom. But I see that he feels that the $8.5 billion in funding for transitioning to renewables was in fact the greatest achievement of his time as CEO of Eskom. I wouldn't have put that one first, because I think that he had perhaps opened a can of worms there so that was not really actually going to make South Africa's electricity situation better. Terence, what do you make of all this?
Look, I think that he what perhaps differentiates him from his predecessors was that he was brought in specifically to, it wasn't seen as a kind of succession, the next CEO, as it might have been, with Brian Damas or anything like that. By the time he was brought in, it was a crisis situation, and he was the guy who you had to sort it out. And that's probably why those 27 or 28 other people turned it down. In fact, I think it was the Black Business Council, or someone once referred to SOEs as the abattoir of black professionals.
Well, that's a good phrase.
So the poison chalice literally, as one of our viewers says. I agree with Marius. I think he will be judged fairly kindly, but perhaps out of his depth. But perhaps it's a depth that one executive in a million would be able to thrive in. So I think one of the big problems with Eskom, and I think with our whole SOE infrastructure, is that it's not about performing a certain particular function, or at least that's one of a number of other goals. Now, this is before you get to the corruption, but it's also about transformation and about creating jobs and about this and that and the next thing, and making sure you're doing appropriate procurement, etc., etc., etc. So I think that the whole environment, and this, as I say, before we get to the corruption and the allegations of murder and whatever, it's just it's just not plausible. Something is going to have to be turned around. And I think as far as the energy transition goes, I think I take a kind line to him there. I think that he understood you had to get the existing assets moving, but for various reasons, including alluding to what we were speaking about earlier, our ability to trade with our trading partners, carbon footprints, and your green credentials are going to count towards that. So irrespective of whether or not one considers himself an environmentalist, I think that, he can be proud about getting the money in, but what happens to that money once it's on shore? there we have another issue.
Right, and we actually did a story a little bit a few weeks ago about how that financing deal for renewables is actually in trouble now, because the pro-coal faction in the ANC seems to have taken back control of policy now, and so suddenly the government is doing a bit of a U-turn on its commitments there. So the whole deal may be at risk, which is, I'm sure, another reason why the Europeans and Americans are not super pleased with us right now. Marius, I think for me the thing about this is it feels like it's kind of de Ruyter's sort of final word. He's had this accusation against him that he was essentially duped into believing nonsense by a shady spy guy about who was involved in corruption at Eskom. And this seems to kind of be his sort of a little bit recounting of, no, actually, this is my version of events. Here's what happened, and I'm not going to talk about this anymore. He doesn't name the names once again, but he does say that Pravin Gordhan and the State Security Agency were told about his allegations and what evidence he had. I think for me, the best thing de Ruyter probably ever did was actually be quite frank about the policy problems at Eskom. For example, how preferential procurement BEE have caused problems in the generation of electricity. Your final thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, he's also said the government officials in the past, they still think, policies that the Soviet Union abandoned in the 1980s will work in South Africa today. And they still go around calling each other comrade, like probably one of the only countries in the world where I'm sure even places like Vietnam and Cuba, which are still governed, one party states governed by communists, probably don't call each other comrade and stuff anymore, but we do. So I think he's called a spade, and I think we probably needed it at the time. But I think good for him on doing what he did. And if I were him, I'd just go. Hopefully, he got a good. He's managed to save some of the money he made when he worked at Eskom. And if I were him, I'd just go. Go sit on a beach in Thailand somewhere and drink some beers or something.
Well, I think from what I've seen, apparently he's in Germany. On the comrade thing, there was actually a circular by the Communist Party of China, and everyone who watches the show knows I'm not a fan of the Communist Party of China, but explicitly saying from now on you will not call your colleagues comrades, you will call them Mr. and Mrs. or Doctor. If you that
interesting.
But the thing is, whatever when I think of China, it's a serious country.
Right. Speaking of, you mentioned Thailand, Marius. There's just been an election in Thailand, and Thailand has had, shall we say, not some great. It's backslid democratically over the last couple of years. In 2014, there was a military coup, and the military imposed a new constitution on the country, which, for example, created a senate that was entirely appointed, essentially by the military or forces aligned to it. And it has often abused the courts as a way to disqualify the opposition from their election victories, which I believe happened in 2014 or 2016, somewhere around there, where the opposition to the government was basically, despite winning the election, was disqualified from the election after winning it. And a lot of their senior members jailed for election fraud without much evidence of there being election fraud. Well, after the military essentially won the previous election, I believe in 2019, a new election has just been held, and the opposition had a stunning victory in Thailand. They won 500 seats, the two main opposition parties. There's a sort of old traditional opposition party which did quite well, but then there's a new opposition party, a sort of center-left party called the Move Forward Party, which is focused very much on winning young Thais over, managed to win the highest number of votes, with about 24% of the popular vote for its constituency seats and 36% of the vote for proportional representation seats, of which they have about a fifth of their seats are from proportional representation. And as a result, it's going to be a little bit difficult probably for the military to overturn this election, considering that it went so badly against them. I don't know. Marius, what do you make of this?
Yeah, well, I think it's quite interesting in Thailand. I think Thailand's changing quite rapidly. A lot of the protests that have happened over the last few years, people were upset about how influential the monarchy is in Thailand. And while I think in general Thai people still have quite a lot of reverence for the monarchy, I think a lot of young people chafe under the influence that the monarchy does have. Thailand still has very strong, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, lèse majesté laws, which means you can't insult the king. So basically, if you say anything about the king of Thailand, you can basically go to jail. And the previous king, he was very well respected. Yeah,
that law is enforced on foreigners. So be careful
yes,
what you
yes,
say,
yes.
Marius.
Be careful.
We plan to go back to Thailand.
Exactly. And the previous king, I think he served. He reigned just for a few months shorter than Queen Elizabeth did. So he was one of the longest reigning monarchs ever. He was held in very high esteem, but he died a few years ago, and he was succeeded by his son, who's a bit of a feckless character. I think would be if the British monarchy, say Prince Harry, was next in line for the throne and he became the king. I think probably a lot of people would lose kind of reverence and respect they have for the monarchy. And I think that's kind of what's happened in Thailand. But I mean, this is obviously the system is a bit rigged against non-military parties. I know for a prime minister who's not backed by the military to be elected, they've got a very strange voting system to get the prime minister in, and they vote for the prime minister. The parliament votes for the prime minister. There's no direct election of the prime minister, so it's still quite possible that the prime minister could be a kind of guy who's on the side of the military. So I think things are very interesting. But I mean, it's obviously good. It shows that democracy is definitely hasn't died yet in Thailand, and I think it's a lesson for other countries like us as well.
Terence, what do you make of all of this? It looks like sort of there was a time when much of the world was actually probably ruled by military juntas or things that looked a little bit like military juntas, and nowadays these things seem to be a lot more tenuous than they once were.
Yeah.
We had these major protests in Thailand, mostly by young Thais against the military regime just a few years ago, which were cracked down on. But it seems at the ballot box that they had a real impact. What do you make of this?
Yeah, look, I think that what you see there is what P.J. O'Rourke said in the 1990s. All over the world, we are bourgeois respectability is collapsing authoritarians, or at least forcing them to go condo. And I thought that was quite interesting. I think Thailand is one of those that went condo, where you had your military influence remaining, but sort of outside the sort of formal the formal halls of power. I think that in societies like that, the military also has a particular status in society. It's there's a sense of that is a kind of repository of tradition and a institution that commands and demands respect. But yeah, these days you do need the legitimation of an election. That seems to be, I wouldn't say universal, but widespread. What I just add to that is that it's also produced what political scientists call the democratic regression or recession, which is not so much about democracies collapsing, but you being diverted into situations where there is some sort of electoral competition, but power is power is exercised elsewhere, or the basket of freedoms that you need for a democracy to function optimally are constrained. Thailand is very much in that basket. South Africa still, I think, remains a very open society, but I would say that is a danger that we could face looking forward.
Just a quick shout out to Real Dude Vision for his donation. Thanks very much. Really do appreciate that. I don't think we have time for our last story. Probably just going to mention it very briefly, that Turkey has had what looks like it's probably going to be the first round of their presidential election, in which Erdogan is facing the most serious electoral challenge of his political career, at least for a while. And it looks like it's going to go to a runoff election on the 28th of May, where the opposition slightly underperformed polling. However, there have been some accusations that the vote is being slightly pushed in favor of Erdogan, with lots of disputes about how the votes were counted or how objections were raised. So we'll have to see what comes of that. But the Turkish election, I think, is going to continue to be quite important because Turkey is a major player on the world stage. And it also will give us some interesting insights into what to expect in South Africa, I think, in 2024, because Erdogan the country has not, shall we say, economically had a great time, especially the last few years of his time as president of Turkey. But anyway, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for listening. We hope that you found the show interesting, and we will be back with the Daily Friend Show tomorrow. Cheers, everyone.